Hello, here I am again, and I posted this morning about tantrums. Quite a few of you have been in touch because you wanted to find out a little bit more. So I thought it might be time to do another series, and today I thought I would just describe a little bit more what a tantrum actually is. And in the past, I've talked to you about what happens to us when our emotions are running high. Our amygdala fires, we're full of adrenaline, our fight or flight response kicks in, and we react. And exactly the same thing happens to your toddler or your child when they have a tantrum. So tantrum doesn't need to be a negative word. We can just see it as a huge outpouring of emotion. It's exactly what is supposed to happen to our child when they feel threatened. The question for us really is, what do we do about that threat? How do we teach our children to learn to manage their emotions? And I will be talking to you a little bit more about that tomorrow. See you later. Good evening. I'm sorry for leaving you hanging a little bit today. It's a lot later than I'd hoped, but rest assured I do have a lot to say on the topic of tantrums, so there'll be plenty more to come. And I know that we were going to start talking today about how to manage tantrums. Actually, what I'd like you to start thinking about is your tantrums or your big expressions of emotion when you were younger. How would they have been managed? What would your parents or your caregivers have done to help you get through them, if they would have done anything at all? It really helps to inform us about our own emotions when our children have tantrums. Do you feel angry when they start to kick off? Do you feel sad or helpless or out of control? Knowing about what gets triggered for you can help us think about whether we want to repeat the things that our parents did for us or whether there's an alternative that we might like to try instead. And I'll carry on talking about this tomorrow. Bye. Hi. Well, yesterday I asked you to start thinking about the ways in which your tantrums would have been managed when you were little. And the reason that I asked you to start thinking about that is basically your model. That is the kind of model that you have for dealing with tantrums today. And no matter how hard we try, at some point that model is going to raise its head, even if we really, really don't want it to happen. Today I want you to take it a little step further and think about the kind of messages that exist behind those feelings. So say for example you feel angry when your child has a tantrum, and that may be because you were faced with anger yourself when you were a kid. What kind of messages exist behind that feeling? It might be something like, "You're too much for me," or "Children should be seen and not heard." So there could be messages from your family or they could be from society. If you've got the time, write them all down, and then tomorrow we'll start to think about whether we agree with those messages or whether we might want to replace them with something new. Hi, well, we've been through a number of different steps so far in thinking about why we respond the way that we do when we're faced with a tantrum. And first of all, we started to think about how our parents or caregivers would have responded to our own big emotional outbursts. And then we started to think about the kind of messages that then went along with that. Those are the messages that we've internalised and the messages that come up for us when we're faced with a tantrum ourselves today. So what I want you to do today is have a good long think about those messages. Maybe you've written them down or you've just got them in your head. Have a look at them and think about whether you still agree with them. And if you don't, and this is the most important bit, think about what you would like to replace them with. So maybe you've got something on there like "crying's not allowed." You could replace it with "I accept all expressions of emotion." It's completely unique for you, and I'd love to hear what you come up with. We'll carry on talking about this next time. Bye. So today's our last step in helping us create a really solid foundation from which to manage our children's big emotions. And hopefully by now you've got a bit of a list of different messages that you've come up with. They might be positive messages, calming messages, something that makes you feel stronger. Whatever it is could be completely unique to you. I'd like you to look at those messages and see if you can come up with a common theme. It might be a phrase that you come up with, it might be a word, it might just be a feeling. But what that is going to become is your mantra, your intention, your solid foundation that you want to stand on when you're faced with your children's big expressions of emotion. I want you to really get that in your mind. You could put it around the house, you could put it on your phone, so that every day you're thinking about the foundation that you want to create when you're faced with your children's emotions. I'd love to hear what you think about that, and I'd love to hear some examples if you've got any, and I'll carry on talking about this again next week. Last week we talked about your mindset during tantrums, and particularly how changing your mindset can give you a really solid foundation to stand on when you're faced with a tantrum. But this week I thought we could talk about different ways in which you can handle a tantrum when it's happening. Before we do that though, I just wanted to remind ourselves what a tantrum actually is. Why do kids have tantrums? And last week I mentioned fight or flight, but I also wanted to mention power, because it's all about power. Kids, up until the time that they're about 7 years old, genuinely think that the whole world revolves around them. And they're experimenting and exploring all the time. So all they're doing is trying to figure out who's in charge, and if it's not them, then what is it that they're actually allowed to do? This is what we're talking about when we talk about testing boundaries. They're testing the boundaries of their power, but they're also testing the boundaries of yours. So if that's the case, if it's really all about power and boundaries, then there are two questions that we have to ask ourselves. The first thing is, how are we going to assert that power? Because let's face it, we are the ones who are supposed to be in charge. So we can choose about how we're going to express that. Are we going to be authoritarian and strict, or are we going to be authoritative, which means more flexible, able to listen to our child's opinion but also withholding our own boundaries? Or are we going to be more permissive? And there are pros and cons to each of those approaches. And then how are we going to decide which of the boundaries we feel that we have to hold really, really firm? What's acceptable to us? And to us, not to our parents or our other relatives or our mum friends, who are often very influential, but what boundaries are actually really, really important to you. They have to be genuinely important to you, because those are the things that you're going to have to negotiate with your children. So we finally got to talking about what you actually do when you're faced with a tantrum. First things first, before thinking about anything else, rule out hunger, tiredness, and overwhelm. Is your child hungry? Are they particularly hungry at the moment? Sometimes they just need a little bit more to eat than usual. Their energy levels are running low, and then they're much more likely, just like we are, to be a bit ratty and irritated. Are they tired? Are they having difficulty sleeping? Are they getting enough sleep? I know it's an absolute pain in your behind to be always thinking about sleep, but it is just so important to mood, isn't it? And what about overwhelm? Are they overstimulated? Have they just had too much activity? Have there been too many people around them all day? Sometimes it's up to us just to create a little quiet corner for them to regroup. So they're the very first things that we need to think about before we start talking about anything else at all. And 99% of the time, it'll be one of them. So you've ruled out hunger and tiredness and overstimulation. And now, for whatever reason, maybe they're frustrated or they're protesting or they're just a bit bonkers at the moment, you're left with an almighty tantrum. What can you do about it? Well, in the words of Roy Walker from Catchphrase, the first thing you can do is simply say what you see. You're just going to reflect back to your child what you think is going on. Very simply, very briefly, literally just, for example, you really wish that we could go to the park today, didn't you? Or you really wanted the green plate instead of the blue one. And that's it. No more than that. And then just sit with them, let them be upset about it for a little while, and chances are, by containing that emotion for them, they're going to be ready to move on very quickly. But what you're doing when you're reflecting back to them is that you're giving them the language to understand their own feelings. And later on, they'll be able to use that gift. And that's what it is. It's an enormous gift to be able to understand their own feelings. So tip number 2, when you're faced with a tantrum, is to suspend all judgment. Something that seems completely insignificant to you might be literally the most important thing in your child's whole life at that moment. I'm sure you can relate to that. I'm sure there are times in your life when you've thought that something was of crucial importance and the people around you just didn't seem to get it. That's exactly what is happening for your child. And we're back to thinking about power and control again here, because often there are many things that happen to our children in their daily lives that they have absolutely no control over. So sometimes they might need one little thing to help them feel some sense of control over what's happening in their lives. So give it to them. Sometimes it's okay to give in, and I'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. But just empathise, think about how crucially important this thing might seem to them at this moment. Did I just say that it's okay to give in to a child's tantrum? Yes, I absolutely did, because that is one of those messages that we've been carrying around since we were kids that says once you've said no to something, you've got to follow through. Otherwise, what? Otherwise, they're not going to know who's boss, or they're going to think that they're the boss. Once you give an inch, they'll take a mile. All of these ways that we talk about children as if there's a battle between them and us. I have a lot to say about that. But just on this one subject of giving in, sometimes you might say no to something, or sometimes you might not treat something with the importance that your child feels it deserves. It's okay to change your mind about that. If you've said no, and from your child's reaction you realise that it's really important to them, it's okay to change your mind. What are you telling your child? That it's okay for them to change their mind too. Isn't that a lesson that we'd all like to learn? So, tip number 3 when you're dealing with a tantrum is to pretend that you are a mountain or a rock. There's a beautiful, beautiful meditation by John Kabat-Zinn, which you can find on YouTube, called the Mountain Meditation. And it's all about us being steadfast in the trials and tribulations of life. So no matter what happens around us, we can stand strong and weather the storms. And of course, for our children, that's exactly what it feels like is happening to them sometimes with their moods. They're very stormy, sometimes very dark moods can come and take over them. And if we can stand strong and be steadfast, be the immovable mountains in their lives, then they can get over their tantrums much more quickly. And also, the benefit to us is that they affect us much less. Often tantrums aren't personal, they're nothing to do with you. As I've said before, they're simply an expression of emotion. If you can show your children that no matter what, those moods don't get to you, you'll be doing them a huge favour. So my 4th tip on dealing with tantrums is to talk to the lizard. When your child is having a tantrum, they have lost any capacity to be rational or reasonable. And let's face it, they don't really have the capacity to be rational or reasonable anyway. So what's happening is that that reptilian part of their brain is firing on all cylinders, that part of them that is just all about impulse. They can't control their feelings at this point, and so you shouldn't try to either. You've just got to wait until they get rid of all of that difficult emotion, all of those difficult urges that they just need to get out. And also for you, you're not feeling particularly calm, so you're not able to feel rational or reasonable either. So for the two of you really, at this point, it's just about dampening things down, trying to stay calm, trying to wait with your child until they become calm too. You might want to talk quietly, you might just want to sit quietly with them. Make no sudden movements, just keep things very calm until all of those difficult feelings get out, and then talk about it later. So my last tip on dealing with tantrums is to think very carefully about what works for you and your family. There are so many different books and blogs out there that all tell us different tips and techniques for dealing with tantrums. But of course, it's so personal. So what works for one child will absolutely not work for another. For example, my little boy has huge tantrums, and when he has these tantrums, he often roars at me. If I roar back at him in a playful way, then he ends up laughing. He dispels all of these difficult feelings that have been building up in him, and then later on we can talk about it. If I were to do that to my daughter, she would probably find it really offensive, and it would make her feel much, much worse. So think about your child's personality, think about where you are too and what you can manage to do, and that will help you think about different ways that you can help your child get rid of these difficult emotions that have been building up for them. So you'll notice that during this series, I've talked almost exclusively about you, about how you are going to contain your child's big emotions. And that's a big burden to carry, it's a big responsibility. If you think about it, we're almost like these lids on pots that are constantly on the verge of boiling over. So what happens to your emotions? What happens when you're taking on all of that big feeling yourself? Well, the main thing to think about is to make sure that you prioritise, have as your absolutely top priority your own resources. If you're running low, then all of these things that we're talking about are going to feel so much harder to do. But the second thing to say is that, of course, it's okay to explode sometimes. Sometimes that pot is going to bubble over. As long as we say sorry afterwards, what is it that we're teaching our children? Simply that it's okay to make mistakes and that it's okay to say sorry. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I'll look forward to talking to you all again soon. Bye.